Okay, we're going to get started here. Welcome. Thanks to all of you for coming today. I'm Dr. Mark Morey, the head of the Project on Military and Diplomatic History here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. For those of you who haven't been here before, our project seeks to promote the use of history in the understanding of contemporary foreign affairs. This event happens to be the last event I'm going to be doing as director, which is a bit bittersweet for me, but Mark Cancian, who is, Mark, are you here yet? Okay. He's going to be taking over the program along with Sam Byers, who is, you probably met, checking in. So they've got a couple exciting events coming up shortly here. On February 7th, we are going to have the Rise and Fall of the ABM Treaty, which we're co-hosting with the CSIS Missile Defense Project. February 14th, we have an event on the history of Boko Haram. And you can find information for that on our website. You can also sign up to be informed of our events. And also remind everybody to make sure to silence your cell phones. Another tidbit I like to give people is to hopefully stick around after the event to swap business cards. We like to promote interaction among people in this community who are historically minded, and something we think is needed is more history in this town. I'd like to thank I know some of our former speakers here, including Mr. Bob Sorley's here in the audience. Welcome, Bob. Bob took part in our Ken Burns panel, which some of you may have seen, which was our most highly rated event. One of our speakers here, Eric, was also here for that. We are hoping Senator John Warner will be here. He's a bit frail of health, but he spoke at one of our events earlier this month as well. 50 years ago today, the Vietnamese Communists launched what became known as the Tet Offensive, which was so named because it happened during Tet, the celebration of the Lunar New Year. Attacking during a holiday ceasefire, the Communist forces attacked most of South Vietnam's towns and cities in an effort to destroy the South Vietnamese government and its armed forces and incite popular uprisings. And what happened next remains among the most controversial episodes in American history. So we've invited 4 of the world's leading authorities on Tet here today to discuss what actually happened and to talk about why it matters to us today. So I'll go ahead and introduce them in the order that they will be speaking, starting here on my immediate right with Bing West. Bing served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Reagan administration. In Vietnam, he served in the Marine Infantry, including duty with the Marine Combined Action Program and Force Recon. His account of his Combined Action Platoon, The Village, has been on the Marine Corps Commandant's reading list for 40 years. He's also written many other highly influential books, which I'm sure a lot of you have read. And he's won, among other things, the Marine Corps Heritage Prize, the Colby Award for Military History, the VFW Media Award, and the General Goodpaster Soldier Scholar Award. He's, as you may know, also, in addition to spending lots of time in the fields in Vietnam, he also spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan on the battlefield reporting. And he's a member of the St. Crispin's Order of the Infantry, and he also serves in the Hoover Institution Working Group on Military History and Contemporary Conflict, which is where I've had the good pleasure of getting to know him. So thanks, Bing. And welcome, Senator Warner, too. We're glad you're able to make it, join us here today. Thanks, great to see you. I'll next introduce Pierre Aslan, who is professor and Dwight E. Stanford Chair in American Foreign Relations at San Diego State University. His primary area of expertise is the history of American foreign relations with a focus on East and Southeast Asia and the larger Cold War context. He's a leading historian of the Vietnam War, a subject that has fascinated him ever since he watched Sylvester Stallone's Rambo: First Blood Part 2 in high school, which I found particularly interesting. And he's especially interested in the decision-making of Vietnamese Communist authorities during the war, which is why we have chosen him to cover that subject today. His books include A Bitter Peace, Washington, Hanoi, and the Making of the Paris Agreement, which won the 2003 Kenneth Baldrige Prize, and Hanoi's Road to the Vietnam War, 1954 to 65, which won the Arthur Goodsight Book Award. And he's just very recently completed his third book, Vietnam's American War, A History, from Cambridge University Press. Pierre, if you feel free to hold up the copy. You've got one here. Very, very new book, which surveys the Vietnamese Communist experience during the Vietnam War. Our third speaker, Dr. James Robbins, is a columnist for USA Today and senior fellow in national security affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Dr. Roberts is a former special assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and in 2007 was awarded the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Joint Meritorious Civilian Service Award. He's also a former award-winning senior editorial writer for foreign affairs at the Washington Times. He's taught at the National Defense University and Marine Corps University, among other schools. He's author of one of his books is The Real Custer, From Boy General to Tragic Hero. Last in Their Class, Custer, Pickett, and the Goats of West Point. And most significantly for today's subject, This Time We Win, Revisiting the Tet Offensive. And our fourth speaker, on my far right, Eric Villard, has worked at the U.S. Army Center of Military History since 2000 as a specialist in the Vietnam War. He has written 2 books on the Vietnam War, one being the 1968 Tet Offensive battles of Quang Tri City and Hue. The second is a huge history of the Tet period, which has just been published. He's got a copy there. You can also find it online. That is also fresh off the presses. It's a book that a lot of us have been waiting for. As I understand, it started in the 70s, I think, when work started on it. Yeah, so this has been 40 years in the making. Eric has only been working on it for the latter part of it. But needless to say, this is something we've been waiting for a long time. He also, in his personal time, directs the Facebook group Vietnam War History Org, which has grown to nearly 25,000 members since its start in spring of 2014. And his passion for U.S. Army history has also led him to develop an online visual database of the Vietnam War using Google Earth-based 4D GIS technology. So I've asked each of the speakers to talk for about 15 minutes, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it to the audience. So, Bing, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I'm honored to be here, especially with my peers, most of whose works I've read. Ironically, Eric, I was just reading this morning your account of Quang Tri and Hue, that one. Yeah. And so it's funny that I have a chance really to see you sitting right here. By way of background, it's very simple. I'm a grunt. I fight wars. And therefore, the frame of reference I carry is that of a fighting man. And I spent a lot of time in Vietnam, all over the place, Force Recon and the Combined Action Platoons, and then for the RAND Corporation, all around that place. Let me get right to the heart of it, and my lesson about Tet and pertaining today is very simple. The most critical decisions in war are made by very, very few men, and they don't listen to anybody except each other. And that was true then, and it's true today. Now, you can say there are different theories of history and warfare. Certainly, Tolstoy's notion of the great man on horseback making the decisions versus the masses, versus the political body, versus the organization, he came down very, very strongly in terms of it's the organization, it's the feeling, the sinews of the entire nation that determine victory. But he was looking at a certain kind of war, more like World War II. When you look at something like Vietnam, what struck me most about Tet was the colossal failures of the decision makers at the top on both sides. And I could argue the same is true of my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, where I've spent an awful lot of time too. So of all things, that's what I take away. When you look at it from the Lao Dong point of view, from the point of view of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, they honest to God believed that the civilians were going to rise up. I mean, that was really, really stupid. And any grunt could have told them the first thing the civilians do when you begin to shoot at them is they run. They get the hell out of there. And yet the top had persuaded itself that this was going to happen. And many of the North Viets going into Hue were actually wearing their best uniforms because they thought they were going to get a victory parade when they walked down the streets. They made colossal mistakes at the top. But by gosh, we were their equal step by step. We had a man by the name of General Westmoreland who was in charge. And he had a view that, I don't know where he got it, but he had this view that this was going to be a war of attrition, and he was going to win it by going out in the middle of the jungles and fighting those. And the North Viets were really good infantrymen, and fighting them out where we had no relative advantage, and somehow we'd kill enough of them that they'd stop attacking. The whole thing made absolutely no sense. And when Tet came, he wrote that Tet is trying to draw away our attention from the greatest threat, which is at Khe Sanh. This is what the four-star general believed, that everything that was occurring around the country was because he had this theory that his true place was going to be at Khe Sanh, which is in the middle of nowhere. And the Marine general who was sent out to Khe Sanh, I had the misfortune of spending time out there with Force Recon, getting my ass shot off, and finally it took an F-8 with two 2,000-pound bombs to get us out of there near the Ben Hai River. The place was just loaded with North Viets. We had no relative advantage, and the Marine general at the time said, you could lose Khe Sanh, and you wouldn't have lost a damn thing. So what you had at the top when Tet occurred was a colossal clash between Westmoreland, who genuinely disliked the Marines who were up north to the extent that he sent a cable to General Wheeler and said, I have to tell you that the professionalism of the Marines falls so far short that I am very, very worried about the situation in Quang Tri. And those of us who were up there in Quang Tri, and if I look like I'm angry, it's because I am, we called the demilitarized zone the dead Marine zone because we had to stand there and let them bring up all their artillery and shoot at us day after day after day because this man who was supposedly our four-star had this fixation on going out to this tiny little outpost in the middle of nowhere that had 3 hills overlooking it and tell us to hold on to that, sucking away all the manpower from in the lowlands. And then when all of Tet takes place, he says, aha, it's a giant diversion. Now they're going to go to Khe Sanh. And he was in charge. It's scary. He so much disliked the Marines up north when this was going on that he sent General Abrams up to take command. General Abrams really couldn't figure out the war. He had just arrived, so he was trying to stay out of this. And then the next thing that Westmoreland does, he takes away the Marine Air and gives it to the Air Force to teach them a lesson. And you think, where's the man? What is he possibly thinking of? And that was the situation when you look at the opportunity that was there. And you say to yourself, all right, they threw the kitchen sink. They just threw away the Viet Cong. They just ended up getting them slaughtered in battles in the urban area where they have no relative advantage. Now what are we going to do? Well, you could say, if you were really calculating as a general, you'd say, time for me to have a little talk with our president and say, Mr. President, this is the perfect time to say to the American people, we're not going to take this crap anymore. So we're going to start bombing those dikes. We're going to bomb Hanoi. We're going to close off the ports. We're going to hit them and hit them and hit them. And you'd turn around to Chew and you'd say, we're tired of you not having a draft. You are going to have a draft. And anyone who's a traitor, you are going to put in jail or you're going to execute. The mayor of Hue knew the attack was coming, called in his city council and said, quick, go and hide with your people, and never even told General Trung the attack was coming. So what I drew from the whole thing watching this, close to idiocy at the top, generals who weren't acting as generals, not trying to figure it all out, just reacting, And I think that the Viet Cong and North Viets were just as stupid, except that in the end, our will broke here at home, and they lucked out because of it. But it wasn't because of this theory they had that when they went into Tet, the people were going to uprise. And I say that, therefore, my lesson that I urge more than anything else is, only a few people make decisions in war at the real top. And they generally just don't really ask for a lot of information from others. And that was true then, and I would argue it's true now. Look, what was the major battle in Iraq? Fallujah. What happened in Fallujah? The generals on the ground, including Mattis, were not consulted. They were ordered to attack, then they were ordered to stop. They had Zarqawi trapped, then they're ordered to pull out, and not once did the people at the top think of talking to the general on the ground. They were just talking to each other. And when you read the minutes of the meetings at the top, it's amazing that the National Security Council, the few that were there, were talking to each other, but never thought of reaching out to get the information. And the other thing that has now crept in the way we make decision-making is two things. First, anyone who's making a decision better not write it down anywhere. I mean, everyone has learned that. Don't keep memos and don't put stuff in memos. And the second thing is televideo. If you're anybody today, you have a televideo machine. If you don't, you're not up in the hierarchy. And when you're on the televideo, you're talking with each other, so you're really gossiping more than getting work done. So when I look at Tet, I say the one thing that really appalled me was the generalship at the top. And I have to say, looking now, today, I can't say that we've corrected that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bing. Pierre?
Thanks. Thanks. It's a real treat to be here and to be part of this event. Bing, there's a lot of things you mentioned that are entirely consistent with what I'm going to say. Before I do, the Rambo thing is absolutely true. People always assume that by virtue of my name and the fact that I work on Vietnam, that my relatives fought in Indochina or colonized the Vietnamese, and absolutely not. I'm French-Canadian, and I have no connection whatsoever to the Vietnam War except for Sylvester Stallone. Bing, you talk about how you fight wars, and being French-Canadian, we're proud of not fighting wars because we don't want to fight for the British crown, right? It's like there's a long tradition of trying to avoid getting drafted so as to fight for the British and so on and so forth. So at any rate, I've no military background. My work is purely academic, and as Mark has suggested, over the last 20 years or so, it's consisted primarily of trying to figure out what the guys on the other side were thinking. So we've studied at length what Kennedy and Eisenhower before him and Johnson after him and Nixon were trying to do in Vietnam. And we have a relatively good record of how they arrived at the policies they would eventually implement. And what I've been doing is trying to figure out exactly what the guys on the other side were thinking and doing as these key American policymakers were doing their own thing. So for 20 years, I've been mining the Vietnamese archives. I've been going to Vietnam to gather whatever information I can. The archives are very challenging, as you can imagine, right? It's not everything is accessible. The party archives remain closed. The government archives are opened. The archives of certain ministries, however, are inaccessible, namely defense and foreign. But still, over 20 years, I've managed to gather a significant amount of evidence from those archives, and that in conjunction with discussions with people in Vietnam, and also research in British, French, and Canadian archives, has allowed me to kind of develop a decent sense of what was happening in Hanoi among decision makers as the United States was contemplating moving against Vietnam and eventually moving into Vietnam. And this last book of mine is basically a summation of of what I've come to find out during that two-decade period. It's a really, really interesting history. A lot of what we think we know about what was happening in Hanoi is completely false. It's completely misguided. And to me, that's really key in all of this, right? Imagine studying World War II without having a sense of who Adolf Hitler was. And we've been doing this with Vietnam. This idea that Ho Chi Minh ran the show in Hanoi, it's a myth. Ho Chi Minh is sidelined in the early 1960s. He's dead in 69, and yet the war goes on for another 6 years. We've never really asked ourselves, well, if Ho Chi Minh is dead, who's running the show? And to me, that's just stunning. And sure enough, I mean, studying Hanoi really helps shed light on some of the more critical aspects of the American war in Vietnam, including the Tet Offensive. Now, on that topic, just the first point I want to make is that this is not Ho Chi Minh's baby. It's not Nguyen Giap's baby. This is Le Duan's baby. By 1964, Ho Chi Minh, as I was saying earlier, has been marginalized, along with Nguyen Giap, the famous Dien Bien Phu general, who's his ideological ally. Ho Chi Minh is seen as too moderate by this hawkish faction within the Hanoi Politburo. And that faction is led by a guy named Le Duan. There's references to him in the Ken Burns series. Le Duan is the paramount leader in Hanoi. He's the guy calling the shots. And as you point out, decisions in Hanoi are made by a handful of individuals. There's really 4 of them who are key. And Le Duan is the most important. He's the Kim Il-sung of northern Vietnam, the Mao, the Khrushchev of North Vietnam. And by 67, he's kind of losing patience with the war. He feels it's stalemated, and he wants something big to not just change the complexion of the war, but to bring about what he calls decisive victory expeditiously. And the Tet Offensive is the plan that eventually he, with the military brass, the top military brass, come up with. Like every major Le Duan campaign, it coincides with an election year in the United States. The big pushes made by Hanoi during the 60s and 70s were invariably made during an election year in the US. Le Duan is deliberately playing the American political calendar. There's a big push in 64 to win the war before the Americans bring in their own troops. That fails. There's another big push in 68, Tet. That also, as I'll explain, fails. The next big push, 72, another election year in the US, that's also a failure. And that's not coincidence. That's absolutely deliberate. They have an understanding of the American political culture that really conditions their approach to the entire conflict. So that's the first point I want to make. This is Le Duan's idea. Le Duan is a hardliner. He's highly dogmatic, and he wants to defeat the Americans, and he wants to humiliate the Americans because he's also an internationalist, and he wants Vietnam to serve as a vanguard for the rest of the world that he sees being oppressed by imperialists and so on and so forth. The main objective of the Tet Offensive, the main military objective, is to crush the South Vietnamese army. The whole Khe Sanh thing, that's to pin American forces down and preclude them from coming to the rescue of their embattled South Vietnamese allies. And I don't know if the most critical, again, we're so obsessed with the American side of things, right? I would argue that when we look at the American decision to involve itself in Vietnam in 65, it's really a reaction to circumstances that have been set in motion by Hanoi in 64. The onset of what we call big war in Vietnam takes place in 64, a full year before the Americans come in. And that big war is the product of a communist document, a resolution adopted by the Central Committee of the Vietnamese Communist Party called Resolution 9. And that Resolution 9 of December 1963 has 2 main points. It says we have to do 2 things. Number 1, we have to defeat the Strategic Hamlet Program. And number 2, we have to crush the so-called puppet forces. And even after American forces join the fight, those remain the 2 key objectives that Hanoi pursues. Throughout the length of the American war, the primary military objective of the leadership in Hanoi and its armies by extension, right, the North Vietnamese army and the so-called Viet Cong, is to crush the puppet forces. And in the Tet Offensive, the objective is just that. big push, attack the cities, which are largely defended by those puppet forces, and crush those forces. And again, to kind of improve the odds for success, strike at the Americans in remote areas to effectively pin those forces down. If you have a chance, look up this document, Resolution 9. It conditions Hanoi's thinking throughout the war, not just between 64 and the time the Americans come in, but even after the U.S. comes in. The core political objective, and this is another really interesting aspect of the Vietnamese strategy. You know, we always simplify, right? It's well, the Vietnamese are doing this, and that. When they're fighting the Americans, they're fighting them on three fronts. There's the military front, right? So they're trying to kind of hold their own against the U.S. in the south, in the north. They're trying to kill as many South Vietnamese troops as they can. Then there's the political front, right? The work done by cadres in southern Vietnam to win over the southern masses and also to win over soldiers from the South Vietnamese army. Throughout the war, there's a premium placed on trying to get South Vietnamese army soldiers to defect, right? To rally to the communist side. And that's an element. You know, we often say that, oh, the South Vietnamese were not reliable. A lot of these guys actually switch sides or abandon their fight because of communist propaganda, which is remarkably effective. We need to give credit to the efforts undertaken by communist forces that allowed the South Vietnamese army to really never really be able to fight at the level it should have. It's not just that the South Vietnamese soldiers themselves were bad, it's just that Hanoi and its operatives in the South did a really, really good job undermining that army from within. And again, it's an aspect we've always ignored. We always look at what Americans did wrong in trying to account for what happened instead of asking ourselves, maybe, just maybe, the guys on the other side did a number of things right, which no matter what the U.S. would have done, would have produced the same outcome. And from even before the Americans come in, right, the leadership in Hanoi is telling its operatives in the South, every chance you get, talk to the Southern forces, talk to the Southern soldiers, see if you can win those guys over. And so politically, this so-called political struggle is really a key part of their strategy, and one of the reasons why they end up prevailing in the end. The third leg of the struggle is what they call the diplomatic struggle, and that's winning over hearts and minds internationally. Securing support from socialist allies, material support specifically from socialist allies, and then political moral support from third world countries, and then from Western peoples, including the American people. All along, in their propaganda, they emphasize the fact that our fight is not with the American people, it's with the American warmongers. We love the American people because just like us, they love peace. There's that whole narrative that they present to divide Americans among themselves, which to an extent will succeed in further polarizing American society. So within Tet, there's a really big political objective, which Bing has touched upon, which is bringing about this general uprising of the population. Now, you're right, I think you say like they were stupid to even think that, but here's the thing, people are telling Les One in Hanoi, you know, this might be a little premature, maybe you don't want to do this, because we don't think that, politically speaking, the consciousness of the Southern masses is ready for this. But Les One will do as Les One always wants to do. And he proceeds, and sure enough, there's nothing close to an uprising that materializes. But that's also in part because the military objective was never meant. Les One felt that if we manage to really crush those Southern forces, the people in the cities will realize that history is on our side. And at that point, and before the Americans get to kind of come to the rescue of the Southern troops, the people will effectively rise up as one in support of our communist forces, and then demand, number one, the abdication of the Thieu regime, and number two, the withdrawal of the Americans so that the South Vietnamese people can decide their destiny by themselves. That was always a really, really big line that was recited by the authorities in Hanoi, although all along they sought to control what was really happening in the South and what would happen once victory had been achieved. So whatever the impact, and this is the other element, right? That very often we suggest, based on the reaction in the U.S., that wow, those guys in Hanoi were real geniuses. Look at the impact in the U.S., which, I mean, to be sure, right, may well have kind of changed the tide of the war. nowhere in the communist documentation, at no point in my 20 years of looking at this, is there even a reference in 67, 68 in Hanoi about staging this attack and scoring a major moral victory, psychological victory in the United States. What ends up happening during Tet was completely, I wrote fortuitous somewhere else, and you say I think you said they lucked out. And that's exactly it. They never, ever thought that what they were doing in Vietnam, which was strictly to change the situation in Vietnam, would have that kind of impact in the US. But then what do? Having failed miserably at the original objective, they turn around and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what we were hoping would happen, and then they look like geniuses. But again, nowhere is it even suggested that Tet will have this kind of impact in the United States. The objectives are military, political, and intended to change what they call the balance of forces within South Vietnam exclusively. Within the context of Tet, the whole idea of the diplomatic struggle is almost non-existent. And so given what the objective was and what the outcome turns out to be, Tet is an abject failure for Les One. But again, as it turns out, right, through their propaganda, which was absolutely remarkable. The control of information in Hanoi is really stunning. They're able to make clear to everyone that well, actually, this is what we wanted to do all along, and so we won, and so we are great, and history is on our side, and we will prevail in the end. A point I do want to emphasize, we make a big deal of this initial wave of attacks that takes place in late January, the 30th. It actually begins on the 30th because one guy doesn't get the memo. There's a series of attacks that take place on January 30th in northernmost part of South Vietnam. Is because one of the commanders didn't get the note that they were going to postpone the attack by 24 hours. But even that wasn't enough to kind of alert the Americans and their allies to the fact that something bigger was coming. But after this initial wave of attacks, there's two more so-called mini-Tets. We call them mini-Tets, but they're actually really major offensives in March and again in May. And those offensives are again, very, very bloody and really dismal failures for the leadership in Hanoi. So, you know, all things being equal, the reaction in the United States effectively for Hanoi, right, it snatches victory from the jaws of defeat. That's the expression, right? It's like if it hadn't been for the American reaction, this would have been an abject failure for Hanoi. But again, you know, this is Les One, right? Well, okay, yeah, we lost 40,000 dead, but I'm still gonna persevere. And he tries again in 72 with the absolute same outcome. Actually, 72 is even bloodier than Tet. But Les One is obsessed with what he called winning everything, and will persevere until finally realizing of his goal of reunifying Vietnam under communist governance. So he got what he wanted in the end. Unfortunately, a lot of people, including millions of Vietnamese, paid a very, very heavy price so that Les One could ultimately realize his dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre, for giving us the perspective from the Vietnamese Communist side. Now, Jim Robbins is going to talk about the American side.
The American side. Thank you. I think Bing actually summed it up when he said colossal failure of decision makers at the top. We don't really need to elaborate much more from that. Also, I don't know if Pierre can confirm the story, but the one I got was that the North Vietnamese leadership believed that their South was ready for this popular uprising because they read it in the New York Times. So, true story. So I'm supposed to talk about the domestic impact, the impact here on the Johnson administration, the American people. And for that, we need the setup. And the setup was from August of 1967, which when Gallup showed that LBJ's poll numbers for conduct of the war were at their low. That was the August before Tet. And in fact, that was the lowest point in Gallup the whole war, was the August before Tet. And Johnson was upset about this because he figured the war was going well and he needed more credit. And so this is where we get the good news campaign from the fall and winter of 67, 68, when high-ranking generals, decision makers, and other people were going around the country saying things are great in Vietnam, light at the end of the tunnel, et cetera. I mean, that was a setup. So going into Tet, there was this sense that things were going really well in Vietnam, and so don't worry about it. Even though he had people like Omar Bradley saying, well, you know, there might be like a kamikaze attack, like this sort of last-minute desperation attack. I mean, that idea was out there. But the headline was always light at the end of the tunnel. And also, well, I'd like to say that based on my research, it was not a surprise attack at any level of war, strategically, operationally, or tactically. We knew something was coming. In some cases, we knew exactly what was coming. And so even though it wasn't a surprise to maybe people on the ground, it was definitely came across as a surprise at home because of this preparation that had been made with the Good News campaign. But anyway. So when Tet finally came along, the administration projected kind of a confident point of view that, well, we knew attacks like this were coming, the president said, also Robert McNamara said this. Behind the scenes, there was a little more frustration, but a lot of the emotional energy had already been spent on Khe Sanh, which had broken out shortly before the Tet Offensive. Johnson was very much focused on what was going on at Khe Sanh because, you know, he didn't want a damn Dien Bien Phu happening, you know, and he had the sand table in the White House, which I can say is something a top-level decision maker should never do. You don't need our president picking targets. You know, that's not his job, so he should not do that. It's like the President Obama picking drone strikes. You know, stay out of that. Not good. What we did get from the sort of early days, though, of Tet, and this is something extremely important, an error by the Johnson administration, it was something that Pierre touched on, this notion that it was a symbolic attack. It wasn't just luck that produced that, and it wasn't the media that produced that. It was the CIA that produced that. On January 29th, Walt Rostow asked Richard Helms, CIA director, for like a quick laydown on what's going on in Vietnam. You know, why are these attacks, especially after the early attacks? It was the 29th here, it was the 30th in Vietnam. And overnight, he got back a 5-page memo in which one of the points was that these attacks were intended to create a psychological impact. Not that they were a last-ditch attempt by the Vietnamese to win the war by crushing the South Vietnamese army, you know, involving 85,000 troops, but that they were doing symbolic attacks to kind of, you know, have the symbolic effect. There was no evidence of this. There's no intelligence I've ever seen that anybody anywhere on the North Vietnamese side was thinking this way. It was completely out of the mind of whatever CIA analyst came up with this. I'd love to know who it was. I've seen the paper, but, you know, there's no name attached to it. Okay, fine. That immediately was put into talking points for the president talking to the press and the Secretary of Defense talking to Congress and to the press. So that's where the idea came from. And of course, the problem with that is psychological impact of an attack, you know, the symbolic attack idea is completely in the eye of the beholder. So for example, you get analysis of the embassy attack, which was like the headline thing in papers across the country, this meaningless little strike at our embassy that had nothing to do with the overall objectives of Tet, but because it seemed symbolic, right? You're attacking the embassy, and since the administration was already leading with that idea that these were symbolic attacks, okay, fine. We defined victory down to that level. Your entire attacking force gets wiped out. Well, you know, in most military situations, that's bad. You know, that isn't really good. You haven't really won anything if your whole force gets wiped out. But if you define it as a symbolic suicide attack, everybody getting killed except for the 3 guys we captured, well, you know what? That's fine. They reached their objective. So we defined their objective down to this level and gave them credit for something that they didn't do. And that's really bad. And mind you, this has gone on ever since. It is firmly in the mind of every unconventional warrior that we hit, and it's also in the minds of every reporter who's covering our unconventional wars. And if you want to take away from Tet, that's a very important one, and it's a very negative one. When you look at the press reaction, and of course this goes in the context of the Walter Cronkite moment and the idea that the press lost the war in Vietnam, there's something to be said for this being a turning point. A content analysis, a press report shows that before Tet, 3/4 of editorial comments of the war were positive. After Tet, you have about that much being negative. And during Tet, 100% of editorial commentary was negative. So in that sense, yes, there was something of a turning point amongst what reporters wanted to report about Vietnam. With respect to Walter Cronkite, he's kind of been enshrined as the symbol of this, whether he changed his mind or not. Eric and I were talking about this. Evidence on that is sketchy. Maybe he did, in some respects. We're also talking about this so-called lost footage of Walter Cronkite that was recently found. I don't know if you've read about this. A February 13th report he did, which had a different tone than the later in February report that he did. But actually, if you look at the totality of Cronkite's reporting through Tet anyway, it was fairly consistent. Now, if you go earlier in the war, you get, when he's out there riding helicopters and stuff, you get kind of a different take on Walter Cronkite. But so far as Tet and later is concerned, he was somewhat consistent, which is not to approve of his reporting, because I think he was very wrong about his reporting, and his analysis of Tet and what it meant was incorrect. But he said it was his proudest moment. The big takeaway there is that it has become this legendary moment when this honest journalist, the most trusted man in America, who, by the way, was actually number 2 in the ratings, is the bellwether of the nation, the conscience of the nation, Uncle Walter, et cetera, all this mythology, and that he changed his mind, and then Lyndon Johnson, seeing his report on Vietnam, says, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America, which he supposedly said. Okay, fine. That moment and that scenario has become an inspiration to journalists ever since. And in my book, in fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to isolate all of the cases in coverage of Iraq and Afghanistan where you have people declaring, this is the Walter Cronkite moment. Suddenly, this turning point, people kept declaring it like it's something that you could declare or that it was up to anyone to declare. And that meaning, okay, now we're losing. Whatever went on before, okay, now we're losing because we're past this inflection point named after Walter Cronkite. Okay, fine, but it's not real, and it wasn't real in those cases either, but it's out there. And it's something to be aware of because it is shorthand for reporters for inevitable defeat. And they use it all the time. Random car bombing. Oh, it's a Walter Cronkite moment. You kidding me? Okay. It's just like the Tet Offensive. That was another thing. You could do a Google search on just like the Tet Offensive. Someone said WikiLeaks was just like the Tet Offensive. Kidding me? Okay. Anyway, so the follow-on part of this is the notion that the American public, viewing these negative press reports, suddenly turned against the war, turned against Johnson's leadership, and then they were on the downward slide, even though the war was half over. He lost middle America. Well, is that true? Well, no, it is not true. There was, if you look at Gallup polls that ask the question, do you approve of the president's conduct of the war? After Tet, there was a slight drop there. But that doesn't mean that people were in favor of pulling out. It doesn't mean that they were in favor of peace or any of this other jazz. You have to look into other questions, deeper questions in those same polls. For example, the number of Americans who self-identify as a hawk versus self-identify as a dove. From the usual way that Tet is conveyed, you'd think that, oh, suddenly the doves took flight. And Americans switched from hawk to dove in midair, as John Roach said. Well, not true. 60% of Americans self-identified as hawks, and that number had increased 12 points since December, and this is after Tet began. Americans were feeling more hawkish. The number of doves in that same poll was around 26%, 24%. And in fact, another question in the poll was, would you favor settling the situation in Vietnam through the use of nuclear weapons? And more people said yes to that than said they were doves. So you had more nuclear hawks than you had doves. This is super hawks as opposed to doves. So it's not true that suddenly the American people woke up and became Jane Fonda. The hawkishness was well in evidence. You had more people saying that Tet Offensive justified bombing North Vietnam, 61%. That was in a Harris poll that came out February 4th. Another good one in that same poll, 48 to 29, the public believed that Tet Offensive was a good thing and useful because it brought the enemy out in the open where we could get them, which showed that the American people had a better understanding of the central problem of counterinsurgency warfare than the press, than Walter Cronkite. I mean, yes, it was beneficial to have the VC conveniently holed up in cities where we could take care of them. It was convenient to have North Vietnamese units out in the open where we could bomb them, these kind of things. So, that was a positive poll result too. And in the same Harris poll, 43% believed Allied forces would win the battle as opposed to 3% who believed that the North Vietnamese would win. So all of the polling, and I have a lot of other examples in the book, but it all lined up on one side, which was the American people were saying, okay, the enemy broke a ceasefire, we're feeling more warlike, we should ramp up the bombing, all of the things that Bing was saying earlier, that now was the time to get something done. But unfortunately, here's where you get in a problem of leadership. Lyndon Johnson wasn't interested in that. Maybe Westmoreland and Bus Wheeler were interested in that, ramping things up. They asked for more troops. In my ideal world, they would have gone north over the border and changed the war that way, but that wasn't going to happen for various reasons, fear of escalation and so forth. Okay, fine, but these ideas were out there and they were being discussed, but instead Johnson didn't want to do that. He handed off the decision-making to his wise men to kind of come up with what they were thinking, whether they were wise or not. Instead of a massive counterstroke, they came up with the idea of basically doing more of the same, and then ultimately Lyndon Johnson decided, well, I'm just not going to run for president, and I'll make this gesture of sincerity to show the other side that I really do want peace, and I'll ask for talks yet again. This is usually portrayed as Johnson was driven to the negotiating table. Johnson built that table. He wasn't driven to it. Throughout the war, and in fact, in his autobiography, in the back cover, he has a list, this is how serious it is, a list of all of the peace overtures that he made to the other side. Every single one was refused in basically the same language. We're not going to negotiate with imperialists. Tet was the only time after Tet that the North Vietnamese said, okay, fine, we're going to talk. Why? Because they were half destroyed. It was a good time for them to talk. And the fact that he wasn't running for president and kind of linked it to this, I mean, the Chinese thought it was a trap. That's how crazy that idea was. They said, oh, this guy's lying. Who would do something that foolish, give up power just to have this negotiation with an enemy who's fundamentally beaten? Okay, fine. So again, another case of misperceptions that were going on at the time. So this is when public opinion really shifted. Johnson's approval ratings went way up because people said, well, at least something's happening. His conduct of the war, fine, he's going to negotiate his way out of it. But this is where any idea that we were going to do a determined counterstroke kind of went out the window. And besides, by then it was 2 months later after the attack started, and he lost the moment, if he ever wanted the moment to begin with. So for me, I don't necessarily blame the press, because the American people showed that they weren't really zombies of the press. They didn't just go with whatever the media was throwing out there for them to follow, even if the press was biased. The American people's response was, hey, let's go in there and defeat these guys, because that's what Americans like, right? Winning. I really blame Johnson. Maybe he was the one who was influenced by the press, or maybe he was just influenced by his advisors. But the fact is, he didn't stand up and get it done when he could have, if he had wanted to. But that was never his framework for the war, and he wasn't going to change it just because we had won a major victory. So my key takeaways are, don't give the enemy credit for having a better plan than they appear to, because a lot of times they're making mistakes. Don't redefine their objectives down to a point where they win, which seems to me elementary. Press coverage in unconventional wars is just going to be negative, so deal with it. Public opinion is not as malleable as reporters and others think it is. Exploit opportunities for decisive action when they present themselves. Don't stick to your old framework when the ground has changed. And a strong leader can get things done. So that's it for me.
Thank you. And finally, Eric's going to talk about military affairs.
Yes, this will be interesting. I'm going to throw some things out here which may be new interpretations, new evidence, new ways of looking at things. Bear with me. Took me a while to reach these, but I'm pretty confident I know what I'm talking about. I should say, too, one thing before in terms of arriving at these conclusions. As you heard, I do a lot of digital technology things. Actually, my title now at the center is Digital Military Historian. So that means geospatial technology, graphic design, web development, audio-video production, all that stuff. So in addition to all the sources that, I've gotten from the National Archives, all the translated Vietnamese Communist histories from people like Bob de Stott and Merle Privenow. In addition to all those things, and my Facebook group, one of the reasons I started it is so I could talk to the people who are actually there. So, on a constant basis, I'm firing questions. Hey, does this sound right? Is that what you saw? Looking at photos, looking at maps closely, doing the geospatial thing so I can actually see where all the units are. That's how I came to these conclusions. So, looking at the lead up to Tet, as has been noted, it was around April '67 when there was some significant developments in the war. On the American side, you have Abrams come in and really with the mandate to work with the South Vietnamese to improve them as quickly as possible. You have Robert Comer come in to head the Corps Directorate, which is going to support the pacification effort. And then Westmoreland is continuing with the existing American strategy. Now, I may be in the minority here, but I'm actually pretty impressed with Westmoreland in many ways. I don't think he believed in a strategy of attrition where you would achieve victory by killing enough of the bad guys and reach this sort of tipping point and then, eventually reach victory. I mean, he saw the value of certainly killing the enemy, but that was only one way to achieve success. The pacification effort, obviously, the hearts and minds. But a thing that I don't think he's gotten enough credit for, this goes to some points that have been raised already, was his understanding the importance of interdicting the enemy's logistical network, right? Because if the North Vietnamese main force soldiers don't have enough weapons, ammunition, medicine, all those things, they're also not going to be effective. They'll be more susceptible to the Chu Hoi and psychological warfare efforts. They will be spending more time running and hiding and less time fighting. So this explains why Westmoreland is conducting these brigade and division-size operations in the hinterlands. It's not that he's going on a wild goose chase. He's going after this NVA trail system, and it's a very, very sophisticated but very static system. They're not just coming across the border and go which way, or there's literally, 3 main channels in 3 Corps, for example. The Adams Trail, the Song Bay Trail, the Surges Jungle Highway. It's a pretty established network. So if you can get astride those and cut them off, at least interdict them, then you are going to significantly reduce the ability of the NVA and VC main force units. Because we have at the same time a main force war going on, a local force war, a guerrilla war, and then a kind of average person who's kind of caught in the middle. I mean, we're dealing with full NVA VC divisions that are just as capable in most respects to their allied counterparts. So you have to deal with those. So this explains why Westmoreland, over the course of '67, makes a number of important steps to do the one thing that he thinks could actually change the dynamics of the war. He knows that you can't just kill the enemy and eventually win. The only way you're going to make a real difference is getting at those base areas, Cambodia and Laos, cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? To do that, you need to have logistical components in place to make that happen. And where's that going to happen? Dak To, Khe Sanh. Those are the only two places where you can get across the border by ground and also sustain those bases. But those are remote bases, so you have to build them up. You have to build the roads, C-130 airfields, all that stuff. And that's why he had the Marines out there at Khe Sanh. It wasn't just to get them shot up. That was the jumping off point for what was called Operation El Paso. This was his secret plan to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in 1968, if Johnson gave him the authority. Another operation called Operation Southpaw would have South Vietnamese forces go across from Dak To and hit that base area in the tri-border area. The North Vietnamese knew this. And so the Battle of Dak To in November '67, that was a preemptive strike on their part because they knew we were building up. We were putting in 175 millimeter cannon at Ben Het. I mean, they could see where this was going. So this was, in fact, a preemptive strike on their part. Khe Sanh, same thing, right? So I give Westmoreland credit for understanding that really the only way you could deliver knockout blow was doing that. Now, of course, the North Vietnamese beat us to the punch, in a sense. Le Duan launched the General Offensive. And I should point out, too, another thing that kind of bugs me. You may have heard this so-called border battle thesis, the idea that the communists launched offensives at places like Dak To and Loc Ninh and Song Bay to draw American forces in Khe Sanh away from the cities. Hogwash. Okay, you don't do that in November of 1967 when you plan to attack, 3 months later. Americans move around as fast as they want to. Besides, we're already out there. This is already the plan. The diversions were Khe Sanh and Dak To, but in mid-January, right? People don't know about the Dak To, but the 1st Pavan Division comes and threatens Dak To. And what is the goal? It's not to draw American forces. It's the elite South Vietnamese airborne battalions, right? The Joint General Reserve Force, the Marines, the 8 airborne battalions, the 6 Marine battalions. Those are the only strategic mobile reserve the ARVN had. And those were the folks that would be best positioned to stop a VC attack against the cities. That's what they were trying to drive away, and they did. They drew away most of them. And in fact, the 8th Airborne Battalion was on the tarmac at Tan Son Nhut, ready to go up north when that 30 January attack happens one day early. And so they stayed, and sure enough, they came in really useful the next day. And about that point, this is the intelligence failure. Yes, to a significant extent, there was an intelligence failure, but that came at a cost. The North Vietnamese exercised such tight operational secrecy that most of their senior commanders did not know that a general offensive was going to happen until October or November, right? So this whole idea of Dak To being diversion to Tet, no, they had planned long before. Your average communist soldier didn't know about Tet until 24 hours ahead of time. And so this surprise came at a cost, right? You had NVA commanders, VC commanders getting the word, we're going to attack, and they're like, I thought it was going to be March or April. I mean, so they're running around. So one guy's battalion commander is totally drunk because he's at home celebrating Tet. His XO has no idea where his men are. I mean, this sort of thing happened quite a bit. So again, the point here is that I think Westmoreland understood that going after supply is really the only way. Otherwise, they're going to come at you all day long. The same thing with the strong point obstacle system. I mean, believe me, if I'm a Marine at Jiulin or Con Tien, I'd be pretty unhappy, right? Getting shelled by those 130 millimeter cannon all day long. But you needed to have a forward defensive line, right? Because Dong Ha needed the Qua Viet estuary channel to be open because they were getting so many of their supplies by Navy barge. If you retreat back to the Qua Viet, you give up Dong Ha basically, and then you're never going to have Khe Sanh, and you're never going to be able to cut the trail. So it was a part of that. Point or two about the Tet Offensive itself. We said it began 30-31 January. It has a first high point, 17-18 February, and then a second high point, 4-5 March. This is something that not a lot of people know, but the folks who fought at Dui Hoa in Tu Corps had a really big battle, and people down in Can Tho also fought. So that was the first general offensive. The second wave of general offensive began first week of May, right? And even though it was not as strong throughout the country, the battles around Saigon were ferocious. And indeed, some of those VC battalions which had attacked during the first Tet and been mostly destroyed, like the 6th Binh Thanh, they come right back. I mean, different folks, same unit though. There's a second wave that goes into June, so the second general offensive ends. A third wave of general offensive, August, September, mostly in northern 3 Corps around Tay Ninh because the enemy can't get at Saigon, but they try again. And then fourth, Tet 69, right? So there are 4 waves of general offensive. It's only after Tet 69 that the Lao Dong Party, the Politburo, changes their strategy of general offensive, general uprising, partly through exhaustion, but partly because the dynamics of the war are changing, talks are underway, and the United States is already kind of looking for a drawdown. And final point I make about that, those dynamics were already in place before Tet. Johnson had already told Westmoreland he was not going to run again before Tet. Westmoreland and Wheeler had already asked for 200,000 troops back in April and been told no. So the ceiling had essentially been set already. Westmoreland knew from the beginning we'd have about 2 years to build up, about 2 years to pile on, and then after that it'd be withdrawal. Indeed, December 67, his staff was working on a withdrawal plan, T-Day, that they thought might be implemented in as soon as 180 days if the North and South came to a peace agreement. So long before Abrams took charge, that was already in the air. Now, question is, what's the timetable and what form? Of course, that wouldn't be hashed out until middle of 69. But the dynamics of the war don't really change significantly as a result of Tet. You know, the media and the public perception, that's another thing. Again, I have other really interesting stories, but I will stop there so we have time for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for 4 highly informative and stimulating presentations. I'm going to make a few points to reinforce what's been said and then ask one question of each of you, and then we'll open it to the audience. So Bing West brought out one of the key points, I think, of the Tet Offensive, which is that it really brings to a head this conflict between the hawks and the doves, where you have a lot of Americans saying we should be doing more in Vietnam. You have others saying we should do less. And Lyndon Johnson has been trying to pursue a middle ground between these two. And Tet really is a turning point in that respect. And it does, and I think we've heard excellent points about the limited impact, but probably the impact that was most significant was Johnson's decision to withdraw from the presidential race, less I think on the policy side, as we've heard. The interesting point Pierre Asselin makes is this issue of what was going on in North Vietnam in 1967. I think there's still a perception among most Americans that we were facing an implacable enemy who was totally indifferent to casualties and was infinitely patient. And as we now know, and Pierre has highlighted, in fact, the enemy was quite impatient, and Tet was the result of this view that what was happening was not working, that fighting was going against them, and so Tet is an effort to get out of this long and costly war. Jim Robbins makes a number of points that I think are particularly relevant to today. The Good News campaign of November '67, where Johnson is trying to make the case that things are going well. If you saw just in the past couple of days in the news, we've seen here accusations that our current administration is being overly optimistic in how it's depicting the situation in Afghanistan. We've just had some very large, spectacular attacks in Afghanistan, killed a lot of people. The attackers were killed, again, similar in striking ways to what happened with the Saigon embassy. He also, I think his points on public opinion are spot on as well, that do you actually have a surge in public support for the war initially? There's a sense that this is another Pearl Harbor, and we Americans are not going to stand for this. And it's only later, once Johnson doesn't make a big change, that support begins to go down again. And we don't actually have a big policy change coming out of this. The number of troops doesn't go down for the rest of Johnson's tenure, and while there's a bombing halt at the end of March, that's only in the northern part, and the total number of bombing strikes will actually increase later in 1968. And Eric Villard makes an excellent point about the plan to go into Laos and how that was seen by the military as a way to get out of what was viewed as we ourselves were getting impatient with the war. This was an effort to try to change the dynamics of the conflict, and after Tet, there's an effort by General Westmoreland and also the JCS Chairman Wheeler to use the Tet crisis to get another 200,000 troops, which would be used to carry out this move into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So as far as questions, I'll start on this end and go down. So Bing West, you are well plugged in with our current leadership. You've co-authored a book with the Secretary of Defense, so you've been working on one that will come out eventually. Your son has just joined the administration as a senior official in the Department of Defense. We have, in the last administration, there were some lessons taken from Vietnam. I think perhaps the most important one was the idea that Vietnam showed the civilian authorities were too trusting of the military, and this is based on the book Lessons in Disaster. And I think that was an incorrect lesson, but in any case, do you see this administration taking any lessons from Vietnam, and are there other lessons maybe they should be that they haven't been paying enough attention to?
I have no idea. I would just frame it a little bit this way, that clearly if you look at the commander-in-chief is the president. And in the case, the most startling contrast I can think of is President Johnson, who was a sly bully who failed as commander-in-chief and failed the nation because he lacked the courage to continue with a war that he started, versus, I think, President George W. Bush, who hasn't gotten the credit I think he deserves as commander-in-chief, who at the moment when everything was falling apart for him on a scale equivalent to Tet, he said, I'm not going to cut and run, and he made the decision to increase the troops and to send over General Petraeus. So you had one commander-in-chief in one case who made a radically different decision than the other commander-in-chief. Currently, we don't have anything on the horizon that, okay, North Korea. How do I know what's going to happen in North Korea? So I won't even address it. But right now, you have no way of really evaluating the current commander-in-chief. You do have a way of evaluating both President Johnson and President Bush.
Well, that's a good segue into my question for Pierre, which is enemy intentions. You talked a bit about how it's taken a long time for our understanding of North Vietnam to evolve. We're currently facing a situation in North Korea where a lot of uncertainty about our opponent's motives, a lot of speculation. Is there anything, could you talk about how people at the time of Tet in the West were looking at North Vietnamese regime, and was there a way that maybe they could have got it better than they actually did?
Yeah, you're asking a really, really tough question. But I think that's the thing. I think by the time of Tet, right, there's this tendency in the United States to at least in some circles, to kind of idealize, right, the just struggle of these poor people on the one hand, and then there's this tendency in other circles to just kind of reduce everything they're doing to worldwide communist aggression, and I think that's very dangerous, and I see that still today. When we look at the fight against ISIS, right? I mean, obviously ISIS, whatever the agenda, has done certain things right. But still, they're terrorists, they're this, they're that, they're evildoers. We simplify these guys, right? And then North Korea is kind of the same thing. We look at the leadership, and there's they're insane, they're irrational, and we just need to be more careful. I think if Vietnam teaches us anything, it's this idea that well, you really need to kind of respect the guys on the other side and acknowledge the fact that hard as you may try, they might be doing things right that work for them, and that are likely to undermine your own efforts at meeting your objectives. And I'm really looking at recent events, particularly like the global war on terror and the situation with North Korea. At least on the surface, right? I'm not an insider, but I see very little effort made to really kind of seriously take and understand the leaderships of these enemies of the United States, and I think that's tragic. I think that's and potentially quite dangerous if we look at North Korea.
Thanks. And Jim, you make some excellent points about the limited impact of press. The limited impact of the press on public opinion. I wanted to ask if you could talk some more about the impact of the president. We just had a lengthy State of the Union speech last night where there was certainly efforts to make statements on certain issues. How important in Vietnam was what the president did say, or, as people have often criticized, what he did not say?
Well, I think it was critical. Since he was the commander-in-chief, he was the one who was conducting the war. So it was very important. People listened to what he said. And again, if you go back and look at some of the press reporting that people say was biased, a lot of it comes from administration talking points. It wasn't necessarily bias. It was a point of view inside the administration that was being pushed out. That symbolic attack thing, I think, is the most striking of those. But, based on my experience knowing people who've been public affairs officers in DOD, they know that reporters are lazy. And if you do the work for them and, present them with something, oftentimes they will just report it. And a lot of the reporting in Vietnam, particularly the tactical on-ground reporting, there wasn't a lot of bias in it. A lot of it was very straightforward. So again, I'm just trying to reset the balance between the Johnson and the press in terms of who gets the blame. The press gets some blame. I think Johnson gets more for his leadership. But with respect to what he said, I think that he was projecting an image of the war that could be fought on the terms that he had set. This limited war, it wasn't going to go outside South Vietnam. It wasn't going to escalate, and through being patient, eventually the other side would come to see reason and so forth, and that we would outlast them. And he stuck to that pretty much throughout the entire time. And that really set the stage for a lot of these misperceptions and responses, public and press responses, to things that happened in Vietnam that didn't fit his kind of fantasy world image of how this war could be fought.
Great. Thanks. And question for Eric. One of the reasons we set this program up is that our schools, high schools, universities are not teaching military and diplomatic history to the extent that they used to do. We're fortunate to have some here who get to teach, but a lot of what used to be taught simply doesn't happen. And so we are trying to reach especially young people who've come to Washington, maybe not have had enough background. Eric, since you are so attuned to the new media, how can historians or others who know about history get younger generations interested in this sort of history?
Excellent question, and a very important one, something I think about a lot. As you noted, I am attempting to use the new forms of technology to reach our audiences. Even though I might sound like a digital fanboy, all digital all the time. No, it's always a combination of digital and analog, right? This is right here is a good example of that, and we are face to face, and I would have it no other way, but yet we are also able to reach a much larger audience because of our ability to broadcast, stream, put information online, and then importantly, to get feedback. So my Facebook group, for example, is one way of doing that. I wanted to create a community where we could have a civilized, interesting, enlightened discussion about this very divisive topic, where you would have the veterans in the same room as the teachers and the students and the families of the veterans and the scholars, and they're all together, and hopefully kind of, talking about at least certain things that we can all agree are worth looking at. I mean, this is part of the reason I'm such a map guy. I mean, if you ever, get into an argument, conversation with someone about military operations, and pretty soon often it's like, well, wait a minute, but do you know what the topography is actually like? You can't just, if you look on a paper map, you just see a little border. Oh, just go there. Well, you can't just go there because there's mountains that you don't see on the paper map. So it's, so if we can have that type of discussion. So again, I think a way of drawing in the younger generation, this is something I've done, is when I do this geospatial map, right? I'm drawing on my own experience as a gamer. I'm a big video game, guy. And for folks like me and younger who play like Grand Theft Auto, okay, boo hiss. No, it's an amazing game. And the reason it's amazing is it's an open world game, right? Where you have this environment, you can go anywhere, and kind of do anything. That mentality led me to this geospatial system. So now that I have all of South Vietnam mapped with the 1 to 50 maps that are enhanced with Photoshop with all the little icons, I now in my head can go, okay, take a left turn at Highway 512 and go up this road, because it's in my head, because I drive around it every day when I do my research. And this is something that the younger generation gets, right? And also the games, StarCraft and World of Warcraft things, the little, I always thought, if you're gonna do an icon for units, you could use the old symbology, that's fine. But, your average person will look in and see a rectangle with an X through with 2 little lines. What does that mean? If it's an infantry battalion, show a soldier. So that's what I do. I have little soldiers, and I have the little patch for the division, and I have a color, green. Green means American. So just visually, it's also going to appeal to a younger generation. They're going to it's part of their vocabulary. And then I think the other thing I would say is, too, that don't underestimate, the power of, family, history, traditions. That young person may have a connection, a father or grandfather. And so many people who come to my group come for that reason, to find out more about relatives. And sometimes, and this is honestly true, people have come to our group, said, I don't know anything about my dad. This is the only photo I have of him in Vietnam. And within a matter of hours, we have something, okay, here you go. He's this unit, he was at that station, talk to this person, he served with them, just based on the photo. Because we have really good detectives. You look at the skyline, you look at the trees, you look at the uniform, and you can find out a lot. So if you make it personal, that's another way that you'll keep that tradition going.
Mark, if I could
Thanks.
just interject real quick.
Sure.
Just, amongst students, the interest is there, to be honest with you, but it's not being served. We don't have enough military historians. So I look at San Diego State, for example, right? We're actually looking to find funding to hire a diplomatic historian because our students, we realize, are really, really interested in that kind of history, but no one is doing it. And so it's just to be clear, it's a failure on our part in university circles to serve that particular interest, which could partially explain why enrollments in history programs have, let's face it, been struggling recently.
Yeah, I
Mark,
think that's right.
something
That's
to add to
consistent.
that.
Yes, Jim.
Before, a couple days ago, I heard from a history teacher who had seen something about this event and was happy that this type of thing was going on. A history teacher wanted to add more to his curriculum on Vietnam, and so he was going to tune in. So, how you doing? But it shows that, again, it was good to hear that. It's okay. There's someone out there who's trying to correct this deficiency in teaching of American history, and teach a little more depth about Vietnam than the usual kind of thing you get. And with respect to Facebook, just to expand on what Eric was saying, I was recently doing some work on Ben Tre, the town we had to destroy to save it, so-called, thank you. But I went to the 9th ID Facebook page and said, hey, can anyone help me with this? And I got some good feedback. So yeah, it's amazing what's out there, the people out there who are willing to help, willing to talk about their experiences, and all you have to do is go out there and look and ask.
Great, thanks. And comments about the demand for history, I think, is that's what we heard from a lot of people that come talk, that young people are interested, but they're not being well served. I would also point out we are webcasting this event like a lot of our events, and one good thing about the internet is people can get it and then they forward it to others. The Ken Burns event we had, I know, has over 25,000 hits on YouTube, which is very good by think tank standards, and so we encourage you to send this event on to others and our other events on our website. So we will take questions in groups of 3. If you could state your name and affiliation and then ask a brief question. We'll start with the gentleman on the aisle here. There should be a microphone to come around. Is it on?
Thank you. I'm Wayne Merrill, also with the American Foreign Policy Council. I haven't heard technology. I haven't heard. Okay. I haven't heard any of the panelists basically refer to the broader context of what was going on, not just in America, but in the world. I'm going to be giving a seminar at AFPC about '68 because it was a global phenomenon in which Tet was kind of the curtain raiser of a year in which de Gaulle was almost overthrown, in which the Prague Spring was crushed, in which there were events going on in Germany, Japan, Mexico, many other countries, and in our own country, many things that were unrelated directly to Vietnam. Race riots, the assassinations, everything that happened in Chicago. Vietnam was part of that. But part of it, I think that what is hard for a lot of people to understand, and I take the point that the North Vietnamese had no idea what the reaction of this country was going to be, is because they had no idea at the extent to which the youth culture, particularly of universities, and I was at the University of Wisconsin, which was one of the most activist at that time, was affected by a broader context in which Tet took place, and particularly the incredibly pernicious influence of Maoism and the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which we now understand was a catastrophe, but the extent to which it was accepted as the wave of the future was just unbelievable. Just a final point is that when Walter Cronkite on Fridays would announce the number of American killed in action in Vietnam, the audience in the main lobby of the Student Union of the University of Wisconsin applauded. That was the culture of much of left university America at the time of the Tet Offensive. And I think that context helps explain why that military operation had such an enormous reverberation in the politics and in the policies of our country, far beyond what anyone in Hanoi would have expected.
All right, thanks. We'll take 2 more. It's Ambassador Negroponte, correct? Yes, thank you for joining us. Get the mic. And thank you, sir, for joining us as well.
really very interesting. If you've lived through this in one way or another, you never can quite let it go. I served in Vietnam for 3.5 years as a political officer. I served a total of about 10 years on the Vietnam question in the State Department, including the Paris peace talks. Got there just when the riots were happening against President de Gaulle. And I served with Dr. Kissinger when we concluded the peace agreements. And I arrived in Saigon in May of 1964 on Buddha's birthday. I'll always remember that. It was Buddha's birthday. I share Bing West's view of Westmoreland's leadership qualities or lack thereof. And I had opportunities to see him close up. I sat in mission council meetings that were chaired by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, whom I revered. I heard him explain his strategies, even had opportunities to play tennis with him from time to time because junior officers were commandeered to play tennis occasionally with the more senior personnel serving in Vietnam. So I have, and this goes to the issue of the reaction to Tet back here in Washington. And I have this view, and I'd love to hear your comments on it, that if Westy, instead of asking for 206,000 more troops, had recognized what you all seem to recognize here, that this was a real strategic defeat for Hanoi, and said, Mr. President, we've reached the point now where we can safely withdraw a couple of 100,000 troops. Would the reaction in the United States have been completely different?
Actually, we've got a lot of good material there, so why don't we answer these two. We'll start with Bing and then go down. Feel free to respond to what we just...
I've always admired John's ability to cut to the heart of the matter, and he has, and I can only agree with him, that if General Westmoreland had played his hand differently, it would have been a different war.
The 68 question is really significant. I mean, Tet, the effects of Tet domestically and internationally are amplified by everything that's happening in the world in 1968. And you're spot on. I think one of the things we failed to do on the panel is really underscore the relevance of this international context. As far as Hanoi is concerned, Hanoi is always trying to co-opt the kinds of people who become very active through 68, particularly in the Western world, right? So they're constantly, inviting students at their missions overseas, or else, even academics to come to Vietnam to visit liberated areas. But as far as the campaign itself, Tet itself is concerned, there's nothing in the preparations that says that this is Tet will be targeting these guys. There's all kinds of other efforts undertaken to kind of address the international community, but Tet itself is not one of those elements.
With respect to the campus issue during Tet, I couldn't find, I was looking for numbers on that, like youth support. I did have polling from the spring of '67 on broken down by age groups, and it actually showed that youth support for the war was greater than other age groups, which is a little counterfactual and surprising. It also showed that there was majority support for the war on college campuses. Among college students, there was majority support for the war, and that the small, loudmouth minority of extremist hippies who got all of the press coverage, their influence has been magnified, but the kind of silent majority of students backed the president. I found that to be particularly interesting. With respect to what if Westmoreland said, let's do a troop drawdown, I think that's a very interesting concept. The troop ceiling that Eric had mentioned, this was another of those self-inflicted wounds of perception, because since Johnson made it for a political purpose in '67, when Westmoreland was saying, well, let's just break it, okay, that became the news story. And in fact, when even discussion of breaking the troop ceiling was leaked, that became like headline news, and that's when the administration said, okay, forget it, we're just not even going to talk about it. And in the end, they didn't even get troops to the ceiling, which seemed kind of silly. But if Westmoreland had said, okay, let's pull troops out, I can just imagine how that would have been reported. It's a retreat. It's a defeat. You know, we're leaving, like we know why they would do it, but how would it be perceived? It would have totally been spun the other way. It's like, oh, we must be losing. We're turning tail and running. So I think it's a very engaging idea intellectually, but I think if it was put through the meat grinder of the press, it would have been projected as America just like giving up and turning tail and running and enhancing that notion that Tet was the enemy victory.
Let me just, one quick little thing that may counter that, though, is the Marines, obviously, in Westmoreland, really hated each other. I mean, there's just no other way of putting it. Once Abrams spent some time up there, he pivoted toward the Marine point of view, and the interesting thing that happened relative to what John is indicating, with many fewer troops, Abrams, when he was up there, was talking with this Marine general and a colonel by the name of Barrow, who later became the commandant of the Marine Corps, and Barrow said, why don't you just let us go? Stop this stuff about keeping us on a defensive line. Just let us go. And they did. They started in September of '68, when the monsoons were starting. In October, they started a campaign while Johnson was still the president called Dewey Canyon, and they went into Laos. And they were chewing up the North Viets with many fewer, because now we were fighting our kind of war. And after 4 days, President Johnson said, get out of there, and pull them out of Laos. So if you had changed the flexibility of what you were doing and then let them fight the way they wanted, you could have done it with a lot fewer troops.
Yeah, I think I maybe have an answer that addresses both questions. Westmoreland actually didn't want more troops. His first reaction was, no, we're okay. I mean, within 24 hours, he was writing home saying, yeah, I mean, it's touch and go in a few places, but yeah, no, we're doing fine. By 48 hours, he's like, you know, we're kicking some tail here. It's General Wheeler, right? And for very understandable reasons, right? It was Wheeler who kept sort of poking Westmoreland, you know, from across the ocean, saying, well, are you sure about that? Are you sure you don't? I mean, if you need some, just ask for them. The reason he wanted this 200,000 to 200,006 was not just to send them all over to Vietnam. That's impossible. It didn't exist. But was to reconstitute the strategic reserve. Now, some of those, you know, troops would go over to Vietnam relatively quickly, but the rest would be used to bolster our force to respond to situations elsewhere in the world, which gets to the point about '68. There was a lot of stuff going on, and we had stripped the cupboard bare, right? And the fact is, we didn't have much more to give. I mean, we did do a mini surge after Tet. Johnson did. We sent another, 25,000 troops. We went from 525 to 549. So there was a surge, but that meant like taking the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd, which had been doing riot duty, right, in Washington, D.C., and Newark. A lot of those guys already served a couple tours in Vietnam, and shipping them back, I mean, there weren't the troops, and even equipment. We were going, as fast as we could to uparm the South Vietnamese, but we were doing it by raiding our, inventory across the world in Europe, and just to get them enough M79s and M113s and all of it. There just wasn't that much left. So I actually think that Westmoreland would have been fine with what he had, but basically his argument was, look, if you really want to accelerate the timeline for getting the outcome that you desire, this would be the time to get the extra. But of course, we know it means calling up the National Guard, mobilizing the reserves. And National Guard, some units went over and served with great distinction. But I also did this paper on the 1st Squadron, 18th Armored Cavalry from Southern California, which trained at Fort Lewis, and about 300 of them filed a lawsuit not to be deployed. And they weren't. They ended up sending their equipment and not them. So the resistance to getting more people. And of course, getting them in the pipeline and getting them over there. It was a big hurdle.
Bud McFarland, do you have a question? Got a great audience today, by the way. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Extraordinary, very thoughtful analysis, each and all. I had the good fortune of commanding a unit in the first landing of combat formations in March of '65. And the data point I recall is how unprepared in terms of training and counterinsurgency our American forces were. I had come from Fort Sill, where we taught artillery, and never in 2 years did we ever include in the syllabus 1 hour on counterinsurgency and how artillery tactics differ and so forth. We learned quickly, but going in quite unprepared. Second comment that's been said very more eloquently by the panelists of the utter incompetence of General Westmoreland. I say that from my second year, which was during Tet and before and after, up in Dong Ha, and focused on coordinating B-52s with naval gunfire and 9 batteries of artillery in support of operations in Can Tien, Cam Lo, Rockpile, and so forth. General Westmoreland came up, and this is now right at the beginning of Tet, to our CP, and directed that we fire 50 TOTs every night. Well, I don't mean to be esoteric, but everybody here knows a TOT is when you pull your batteries off of whatever they were doing and put them all taking the time to shoot on a formation of mass troops. We never had mass formations of North Vietnamese until here and there during Tet, but I explained, trying to be as diplomatic as I could, General, this is what happens when you fire a TOT. You leave people in contact being supported by one battery, unsupported, and you never have the intelligence that identifies a mass formation for you to do it. Well, I don't mean to go into the weeds on this, but if you have a general officer in charge of going around the countryside and dictating that you do something that foolish, it's a telling comment upon the conduct of the leadership. But the final point is a little more upbeat. As Bing has said, and others very well, we certainly learned quickly. And Tet is a shining example, really. The Marines and the combined action platoons and their deployment, I-Corps, and what a profound difference it made in turning around the quality of the intelligence in the village level when Vietnamese began to see that we were really changing the quality of life, if you will, village by village, with a corpsman, an engineer, and so forth, that we began to get far better grassroots intelligence, and not one of those combined action platoons fell or was overrun. Enormously effective. Finally, of course, we threw out most of that doctrine, and we had to relearn it again in Iraq and so forth. Thank you.
Just the combined action platoons, the one I was with, we spent 385 days in a Vietnamese village. And I've been back to the village, and they welcome us back. And I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. the Marines had the idea of going into Iraq and Afghanistan that we could try the combined action platoon. Never happened. There was a difference in the culture. The Vietnamese are much more open. The religious overlay cannot be ignored when you're dealing with Islamic countries in terms of whether you're a male and outside the family, and in a way that never existed in Vietnamese villagers. And the second aspect is the degree of distrust went much deeper in Iraq and Afghanistan to putting a squad out anywhere than it ever did in Vietnam. And it was just true, because you didn't know who was going to betray you. And the interesting thing is, when I talked to the Askaris, when I talked to the Afghan soldiers and to the Iraqi soldiers and say, do you know who they are? You know, and they'd say no. They're such good liars that even when they're among us, we don't know who among us will betray us as well as you. Huge difference in the cultures.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say something about the relearning of lessons learned and how we forget things. And based on my experience in professional military education, and when I started in the late 90s, everything was focused on the big war. I mean, even with the end of the Cold War, but there was still this bias in favor of the conventional conflict. And everything else was shoved into this doctrinal concept at the time called MUTWA, or Operations Other Than War, which was everything from humanitarian ops, peacekeeping, counterterrorism, strikes and raids. I mean, you name it. All the cats and dogs like thrown into this one conceptual piece. It wasn't, you know, it was really kind of a mishmash. And we had like 4 weeks of that, 4 weeks to talk about all that stuff, and then the rest of the year was all the big stuff, you know, and operations and so forth. Then okay, fine, I understand how that's important. But it just wasn't taken seriously. And then of course we had 9/11, and then everything got more serious with respect to terrorism. We had doctrinal changes and so forth. But if you look back at the experience of the U.S. military, you can go back to the Second Seminole War, for example, a war I'm sure you're all highly familiar with. And we had joint counterinsurgency operations going on in Florida during that war after the initial phase of, well, because President Jackson said, well,
that intelligence getting down to our area, that something was afoot. And that's about what it was. The intelligence was something big is afoot. No more detail, there was no texture to it. There was nothing, be ready, and so we posted aircraft above the base camp, relieving one another through the night. That was the sole particular precaution that I was particularly aware of, and there was absolutely no indication of anything like what came to pass very shortly thereafter. Nothing.
You want to comment on Eric?
I'm a little in awe here because I'm a huge embassy person about the whole story. I burned a lot of midnight oil pouring over that. And as you say, it's true. They were, by and large, amateurs. At least they weren't highly trained commanders. I mean, they were essentially, most of them were essentially urban spies. And half of them were guys from the rear area they'd pulled in at the last moment, right? Didn't really know what was going on so much. Interesting point, having gotten the 3 interrogation reports from the survivors and some other things, but also, again, my point about look at the evidence. There's actual film footage, taken of the compound. We all know we see Westmoreland out front, but there's actually footage in the front door of the embassy in the interior. The fact is that B-40 that hit the front door pretty much smashed it open. I mean, the whole door wasn't gone, but they could have gotten in if they'd wanted to. And if you see the photos, the dead sappers, there's a pile of B-40 rockets that they did. Yeah. So what's going on? Well, the point is they weren't trying to get in. I mean, that wasn't their objective. Why are they hanging out on the front lawn? At least go into the, Jacobson's villa, hide. Because their orders were within, minutes of getting it, they expected, hundreds of student demonstrators to show up and do a sit down. And then shortly after that, the 3rd Zeon Battalion was going to come and relieve them. So if they'd gone inside, they'd be like, no one knows we're here. So that's why they stayed out. So yeah, it's sort of a Keystone Cop, situation. But they literally, that was the extent of the plan. It wasn't, I mean, they could have done a lot of damage had that been in the cards. But again, it was really, the embassy being added at the last moment. It was really almost an afterthought. That wasn't on their original hit list. They did the exterior, but that honeycomb, which people, if you understand, the embassy, again, this was the new embassy after the old one had been bombed. And that exterior is a steel reinforced honeycomb. The actual building is several feet behind it. So it was a really it did its job. And after shooting a couple of them, they looked like, okay, that's not working. Well, it appears they had one, which actually blew the hole through. But again, the objective was to get in there and occupy the grounds. There wasn't a thought of going beyond that. But I'll just say one thing, and just because it's sort of related to this, it's the power of imagery, right? I think one of the things that lingers with us is Westmoreland standing in the lawn of the embassy, dead sappers around, and him going, well, the enemy very deceitfully took advantage of that. You're like, yeah, of course, that's what you do. I mean, he's such a Boy Scout. I mean, I think that was kind of one of his shortcomings. But so again, the optics didn't really match what was being said. I think the other point is this. Everyone's seen the General Luan execution, but the Eddie Adams, right? Okay, that single image, right, has an enduring power to this day. I just want to say, I think I've actually figured out the story behind it. It's not what people think. The original perception was, here's a renegade South Vietnamese general executing someone in the street. Oh my gosh, these are our allies. What's going on? And then the counter reaction is, well, actually, the guy that he executed, Nguyen Van Lem, was a Viet Cong assassin who had killed a bunch of people. I mean, General Luan's friend and his family. That's not actually true. this guy was a common liaison agent that was in the An Quang Pagoda that was surrounded. He tried to dash out, and he was grabbed by some South Vietnamese Marines. One of those Marines wrote his account of it. And then I compared that to the photos. And sure enough, this guy popped out with a K-54 pistol, right, Soviet pistol, an armband with the designation numerals that he indicates, B26, I think, something like that, and a bicycle. They grabbed him, turned him over to Luan's lieutenants. And you see in the photos a guy off camera handing over the armband with those, with the distinguishing armband. If you understand the letters, it means this guy was part of the Saigon Party Committee, who was a liaison between districts, the core part of Saigon and Subregion 2. And that's who the folks were in the An Quang Pagoda, the 6th Binh Thanh Battalion. He was trying to get out to warn the VC High Command. In another photo, there's a bicycle propped up right there as he's walked down the street. As he's walked down the street, what happens, right? Right up to Luan, 6 seconds elapse. Luan looks, at the pistol, hears from his guy, and just says, bang. It's not because he knew he was an assassin or killed anyone. They wouldn't even know about Colonel Tuan in the GOVAP compound until a couple days later. It's because he was nobody. And what happens afterward? Luem's dead right on the street. South Vietnamese photographer takes that armband, puts it on his chest, takes a photo. That's the point. Luan is saying, hell no, not in my town. This is a warning to the VC and reassurance to his people. That's what it was all about. So,
Pierre, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, on the question about precedent and inspiration, which is really, we talk about the Americans building on precedent, but so is Hanoi, right? So in terms of Les One's intractability, Les One idealizes Stalin. And he looks at the war against the U.S. the way Stalin looked at the great patriotic war against Nazi Germany. That's the difference. For the Americans, it's a limited war. For Hanoi, this is an existential war. So for Stalin, there's no sacrifice too great to defeat Germany, right? And so for Les One, it's the same thing. We can lose these guys, but listen, the Soviets lost 25 million, 30 million. We can lose proportionally the same number. And it's really interesting. Even as he's fighting the Americans, Les One remains obsessed with what he called building socialism in the North, because that's what Stalin did. And he comes out of World War II victorious and also powerful. And that's what really Les One aspires to achieve for Vietnam. So as far as his leadership style, Stalin plays a tremendous role in shaping his consciousness. Beyond that, as far as waging the revolution on the Vietnamese side, right? So the precedents that these guys build on, there's their own precedent in the war against the French, right? But that only produced partial liberation. The big inspiration is Algeria. And the Algerian National Liberation Front. The Algerians won the total independence of their country, right? And how do they do that? Well, yeah, there's that military struggle, but there's also that premium placed on both political and diplomatic struggle. That becomes a hugely significant element in the strategic thinking of the Vietnamese. They really try to replicate what the Algerians have done. And that's partially why they do such a great job at kind of publicizing and globalizing the conflict in Vietnam. That's what the Algerians did. That's how they secured their independence. They just like the Algerians, right? They recognize they're not going to beat the Americans militarily, like the Algerians recognize they're not going to beat the French militarily. How do you neutralize the might of that powerful enemy? You do that by fighting the war, in the global arena. And sure enough, that really did wonders for the Algerians as it would do for the Vietnamese. And it's funny, you bring up the PLO. The PLO we now know, will actually inspire its own liberation struggle after the Vietnamese struggle. The Vietnamese become really, really significant in informing the Palestinian attitude toward the liberation of their land. And say what you will about religion today, at the time the PLO is thinking of itself as a national liberation movement, right? Some of the hardest elements within the PLO are actually Christian elements, right? It has nothing to do with religion. This is a national liberation struggle, and the PLO really models its own struggle on the Vietnamese struggle. So on the other side also, there is that history informing the struggle, which I would argue kind of, really shapes the outcome, at least in Vietnam in 1975.
Mark, can I say one more? Just
I'll
very,
yeah, go ahead.
extremely quickly. Sir, I don't know if you were the guy on the other end of the phone, but John Roach, presidential advisor to Lyndon Johnson, told me the story of when things were going down in the embassy and it was being misreported that he called the embassy and spoke to someone there and say, what's going on, and got the real story, and tried to hand the phone to the AP bureau chief who was in the White House, who refused to talk to whoever was on the other end of the phone because he said, how do I know that's a guy in Saigon? That could be anybody. It could be a guy at the State Department for all I know. You could just be lying to me. And so, John Roach was trying to, get the real story out and connect up the reporters, but basically the bureau chief in Washington said, well, we have people on the ground for that. Who do they have? Peter Arnett, right, who's going to give you the full story, the complete, accurate.
All right, one
Right,
last
good
question here in the front. Yeah, right up here.
Okay. Well, maybe you spoke to John.
I've got some here too.
Yeah, Bud Cole, Professor Emeritus, National War College, and I was at Khe Sanh with Headquarters Battery 113. And this is kind of a tactical question after all the great views we've seen here today. But the question about whether JIAP really used Khe Sanh as a decoy, evidence of that is that, as far as I can recall, they never intercepted the landlines out of Khe Sanh, and they never attacked our water point, which is also outside the lines. On the other hand, if he did it, it really goes to what I've heard today. If it was supposed to be a decoy, they lost probably the equivalent of 2 or 3 divisions doing it. The B-52 strikes were incredibly effective. And I'd just like a quick poll of how many of you think it might have been a decoy, or how many of you think it was a serious attempt to replicate the Dien Bien Phu. Thank you.
All right, final answers, any,
I'll try to make this quick. Short answer is it was both a short immediate diversion for Tet, but it was also, they had a long-term plan to neutralize Khe Sanh, because like I said, they were concerned, they realized, and indeed, Lam Son 719. Where is this staging point? Khe Sanh. So they understood the importance. So basically, from the North Vietnamese point of view, their campaign began in January and didn't end until June, when the U.S. forces withdrew. After Pegasus, we tend to go, woo, Khe Sanh is relieved, besieged, siege. But as far as the NVA are like, no, we're in the 5th inning. They still, had a plan to carry on. And so, and the other thing I should say is it wasn't Giap. Giap was in Hungary because he was on the outs with Le Duan and Zung, who were planning the Tet Offensive. And so it was General Hai, the B-5 Front Commander, who was actually running that. And he was out of action because one of our B-52 strikes nearly wiped out his headquarters. So that's why there wasn't any action at Khe Sanh during Tet. Their headquarters was just still scattered to the far winds.
parenthetically, a lot of the early history said it was Giap, including Philip Davidson's book, which was excellent in other respects, but a lot of the early histories thought it was Giap at Khe Sanh. But Bing.
I just had, as we wrap up, a funny story about communications with Jim Mattis, since he's the Secretary of Defense, and reaching down. When he was the commander of CENTCOM, so the 4-star, and he has 100,000, 200,000 people under him, et cetera, he's over meeting with in Pakistan with Kiani, who was the general over there, and you know, Kiani always played a double game. And Kiani then was saying, I'm going to cut off all transportation through Pakistan because there was a firefight and 12 of my Pakistanis were killed, and this was just absolutely unacceptable. And Mattis sat there and he listened to him. He said, He said, so that's what you think. And so he walked out, he picked up his cell phone, and he called and he said, get me the Special Forces guy who was in charge in the valley who flew in and ordered the strike against the Pakistanis. And imagine now, he's a 4-star general, and within 20 minutes it had gone all the way. Can you imagine the number of people saying, holy shit, you know, and they're passing it down, and it gets down to, and E7, and the sergeant who was in charge said, yes, sir, and General Mattis said, "Hey, this is Jim Mattis." "Yes, sir." He said, "Look, I'm having a conversation with somebody, and I have to know ground truth. You were there?" He said, "Yes, sir, I caught on the strike." He said, "Sir, those son of a bitches were shooting at us for 45 minutes. He said, "I'm telling you, sir," he said, "the only way I could get them off my ass was finally to bomb them." So Mattis said, "Okay, thanks very much, Sergeant. That tells me what I need to know." He puts down the phone, walks back in General Chiani, and he said, "You don't know what you're talking about."
On that note, let me again thank our panelists. Please join me in a round of applause for four great historians.